Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to another in our series of double shot interviews where we bring in someone who's got something to say about the economy. And again today we have David Cunliffe, the finance spokesman for Labor, here to talk about Labor's new tax plan that came out last week. David, why a capital gains tax and not, say, a land tax?
Take the question in two parts. Why a package like we've got? Because we can pay our debt down to zero at a time where that's really important. We can keep our assets for future generations and the revenues they produce. We can give almost every New Zealander a tax cut through the tax switch in this package, and we can fund growth initiatives that will get New Zealand going, get people back into jobs.
But a capital gains tax is quite difficult to police, and you've got quite a few exemptions in there. How much are you actually going to raise?
Well, I don't believe it is difficult to police. It's certainly less complicated than a land tax, which would probably end up excluding farms, because very hard to tax farms on that basis in New Zealand. Look, 27 out of 30 countries in the OECD have a capital gains tax. Because we're about the last in the world to get one, we can certainly learn from the experience of others. The advice that both the Treasury and the Reserve Bank have given is that this is a must-do, and we're moving to the international mainstream, simple as that.
Why have you used the money that a capital gains tax would raise to switch it back into lower income earners? Why not use that revenue to reduce debt?
Well, we are reducing debt. Debt reduces to...
But by the same amount that the government is.
In fact, we're reducing it faster than the government because the revenues from capital gains tax build so significantly over time, even on the very conservative assumptions that we've taken with the assistance of Burl. So, yeah, we get debt down to zero, net debt, quicker than the government does. We get to surplus the same year as the government does. We've chosen deliberately to have a little bit of an injection into growth initiatives and to rebalance the tax for some of the people who've missed out in the last couple of years.
So that's a fiscal loosening in the first few years?
No, I wouldn't call it a loosening because relative to previous governments for the last, goodness knows, certainly as long as I've been in Parliament, both the current government's plan and our plan are incredibly fiscally tight. Incredibly tight, where our focus is on debt reduction. Now, there may be a couple of $100 million...
We're running a structural budget deficit of close to 4% of GDP. Surely you should be trying to address that.
We are, as I say. Not only we hit surplus the same year as the current government, but we are reducing debt to zero ahead of when they do. Now, this is the tightest fiscal framework I've ever seen a Labor Party or government bring down. It is incredibly responsible. We have taken more conservative estimates than the current government in our growth assumptions, and we still achieve those objectives. So, you know, there'll be plenty of people coming back to us in a couple of years saying, gee, I wish we could have had a bit more for X, Y, Z, and we're going to have to look them in the eye and say, I'm sorry, the priority is debt reduction. You asked about the tax switch. Why would you give tax relief to the people on the bottom and the middle? And in fact, everybody in the bottom, 98% of the population who will benefit from this tax switch. And the answer is that people, everyday people in those brackets, spend everything they get, typically. That puts money in circulation, helps lift all boats, and there's also an equity argument. The people at the very top have overwhelmingly been the beneficiaries of the last two budgets, and it's time that that small percentage gave a little back to help the country out of its need.
But doesn't this lock in the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next that happened with the property boom? Because the capital gains tax is not retrospective, it can only capture capital gains in future. So essentially it stops the new generation from getting the capital gains from rises in property values in the future.
Well, that's respectfully not true, Bernard. The Savings Working Group has estimated that a capital gains tax of this magnitude would take about half of the future price inflation out of the housing market. So
but not the past inflation.
No, but look, half of the critics of this say, you know, you didn't do enough, you should have been harder. And the other half say, oh, the sky's going to fall in, you know, aliens are going to eat your children and your pets. That's John Key's line. Bill English says, oh, yeah, should be a great thing if it was more comprehensive. Well, would people please make up their mind? The fact that you've got cannons on both sides probably means that this is about right. I think New Zealanders would take a very dim view if any incoming government took away their gains that they'd invested for retrospectively. I think that's a very poor principle of tax design. Politicians are always, in general, prospective so that people can make fair decisions based on foreknowledge of the rules.
But a land tax would have been able to tax some of those capital gains.
I know a land tax is your personal favourite. Here's the problem. It's very inelastic. That is, in the jargon, you can't move land, so people can't do much with the decisions. And secondly, if you leave farmland in, you hit the farming sector too hard. If you take farmland out, which most parties probably would have to do, then what you do is you hit the suburban mortgage belt too hard. The imposition of the tax is overweight around the middle of the income scale, and that is not what is needed here. What is needed is a more progressive tax that attacks the build-up of wealth amongst those who are not paying tax currently. And, you know, to quote a real good authority, you know, Sam Morgan and Selwyn Pellett both got it right. It wasn't fair that when they made tens or hundreds of millions of dollars floating their companies, they paid no tax on the gain. It is absolutely fair to include company profits and shares as well as gains on farms, which this does do, and to spread that net widely. Land tax is too narrow, it's too inelastic, and it's overweight in the middle of the income curve, which is, by the way, where many of your viewership would be.
Now, moving on from the capital gains tax to the increase in the new 39-cent tax rate in personal tax.
Yep.
Aren't you going to create the same problem you had last time around with this 39-cent tax rate, which forces a lot of people into family trusts?
No, for two reasons. Firstly, this is indexed above 150,000. A lot of people haven't noticed that word index, which means that we will never capture more than, I think, about 1.8% of taxpayers in this top rate. It's lower than Australia, which is 46%. And, you know, it's a small enough pool that the IRD can take a pretty close look at it. The other important thing which we might want to talk about is that we're going to have a real look at trust law. The Law Commission's already saying trust law is antiquated, too easy to hide income in trusts, too easy to avoid tax. The IRD says there's over $300 million a year worth of tax avoidance going on through trust structures. So we're signalling now up front, we want to move the treatment of trusts more to a look-through basis, so on the basis of very good advice, that they're handled more at the beneficiary's marginal rate of tax. It will be much, much harder in future to hide assets in trusts and probably through look-through companies and LAQCs as well. So there will be a push on legal avoidance as well as the recovery of debt through illegal avoidance.
What about those who say changes to these family trust laws and the creation of the capital gains tax just will add yet more people into the tax accounting and tax lawyer businesses?
Well, one of the great things about being, as I said, one of the last countries in the world to get a CGT is you get to learn from international best practice as to what's the best way to do it without creating unnecessary compliance costs. So we like, for example, what the South Africans did around valuation. They gave taxpayers the opportunity to choose their valuation method, including some pretty easy to use approximate methods. So look, we will go into this with the best advice to try to minimise the compliance burden on everybody, but as taxes go, we think that this is the fairest, one of the easiest, and one of the best missing pieces from the tax jigsaw puzzle in New Zealand. It's got to happen, it will happen.
The government, Stephen Joyce, has come out and said there is a hole in your numbers,
Yep.
A multi-billion-dollar hole.
Let me stop you right there and say I've had a team go through line by line what Mr. Joyce has been peddling. Frankly, none of it's true. Mr. Joyce has been setting up a straw man and then knocking it over, which bears no relationship whatsoever to what Labour's mooted. He'll give you a couple examples. Number one, we have absolutely fully accounted, contrary to what Mr. Joyce has said, for the full value of the cash that comes from the SOE privatisation, i.e. we're reinvesting additional money to the same approximate amount from revenue flows into the capital account to offset the fact we won't be privatising. Mr. Joyce either didn't know or assumed the worst. He was 100% wrong, and we can prove it. Secondly, he's alleged we didn't count the interest cost of borrowing. Of course we did. What responsible modeller wouldn't? Again, he didn't ask, he just made it up. Thirdly, he's got so many of the numbers wrong and some quite basic errors. For example, their analysis of the costs of the $5,000 tax-free zone include fiscal drag. It's just that there is no fiscal drag because $5,000 is at the bottom of the tax scale and it doesn't change for anybody when their income goes up. Those kinds of, frankly, pretty stupid, pretty basic errors are right throughout the government's documents, which clearly must have been done by political staff in the beehive, not by Treasury officials. That would be illegal, of course. So let's assume that it was bad management rather than conspiracy, but none of it's true.
Just finally coming back to this point, your fiscal plan talks a lot about tax, but doesn't address the issue of spending. Why aren't you looking at spending cuts in government?
We are planning to reprioritise quite a lot of things, and there will be spending cuts under Labor. We are sticking with the current government's extremely tight fiscal outlook, although we are revising downwards, would you believe, the growth projections, thanks to input from the consultancy Burl, to a more conservative track than is expected in the government's budget. And by the way, the government's budget omitted $9.6 billion worth of lost SOE dividends, and we're having to put that back as well. So, you know, Mr. Joyce shouldn't lecture us about fiscal prudence. We could drive a bulldozer through the government's projections.
Do you think we have a structural deficit problem for the government?
Yes, I think we do. Debt is too high and a deficit of $17 billion is too high and it needs to come down. But under Labor's plan, you get to do that while keeping the assets, while giving 98% of people an income tax cut in net terms and by investing for growth. Compare that with under National's plan, you flog off the family silver and you just try to cut your way out. There is no tomorrow, there's no long-term plan, they've been asleep at the wheel.
But does this plan actually reduce that structural deficit?
Yes, it does. We get to fiscal surplus on the Obergall in the same year as National, slightly less.
So you're not doing any better?
We are paying debt down faster than National. The curve is a slightly different shape. You're an intelligent man, Bernard. You understand that it takes a while for capital gains tax revenues to build up. Therefore, you have slightly less in the door in the first couple of years and a significant amount more in the door later. That means that the curve starts a little flatter and then comes down much more sharply, which is why Crown debt gets to zero under Labor's plan faster than under National's.
The core issue, though, of working for families and interest-free student loans,
sure.
Would you keep them?
Look, in our fiscal projections, there are reprioritisation targets. Now, we're not announcing what we would change. We're not rolling anything in. We're not ruling anything out. But I imagine it's true that by the time we've finished, given the books as they are, there will have to be the odd sacred cow taken out and shot.
How big is that reprioritisation?
I'm not going into that right now because our expenditure track hasn't yet been released. That will be released when we do more announcements between now and the election. But take it from me, and I've known you a long time, it's as tight as a drum. It has to be, otherwise we don't get the debt down.
David Cunliffe, the finance spokesman for Labor there, in another in our double shot interviews here on interest.co.nz. I'm Bernard Hickey.